We're here for another Clean Tech Talk YouTube show, and the topic today is it's broader than Ford, but it's stimulated by Ford's big announcement that it was writing off $19.5 billion of EV investment, completely changing, pulling back from its EV plans, and, well, questioning how it proceeds as a company in this EV transition. It's not really clear how much that's a short or medium term thing versus a long term idea, because the language around this is a bit vague at points. But it also brings up the broader question of what is happening in the US auto industry with EVs and where we go from there, especially in the broader context of what's happening in Europe and China, and not only, but also other parts of Asia, South America. So, to get into it, who wants to volunteer to summarize Ford's change in strategy?
I don't know that we know what their change in strategy is, other than they took an enormous charge off for this quarter. And I saw a comment on an article yesterday from somebody who said, "Oh, the stock just hit its high for the year." So obviously the shareholders love the idea that they're going to write off $20 billion. That seems counterintuitive to me, but that's why I'm not very good at investing, I guess.
Well, well, yeah. So, I mean, one big thing here is they're stopping Ford F-150 Lightning production of the full electric F-150 Lightning. They had a follow-up fully electric truck that was supposed to be the successor to the F-150 Lightning that is now canceled, and they are instead working on an extended range electric vehicle version of the F-150 Lightning, which, Steve, you pointed out in your article, is essentially what the Chevy Volt platform from 15 years ago. And then more broadly, it seems like their strategy, similar to Toyota, is to have different powertrain versions of each model or of several models. So they will have a hybrid, they will have extended range or plug-in hybrid EV, and some of them will have a full electric, I believe, still. Um, but that's and then their full EV focus is shifting to affordable vehicles, cheaper vehicles that they're working on a new platform for. I know you guys have both written and talked and read a lot about these things, but that's the general summary. So, uh, uh, Larry, either dealing with, how about we start with like what exactly happened at Ford,
Yeah.
and what do its finances on this look like with regards to its previous plans and future plans?
So I think kind of we talk about all these terms, and a lot of the times they might go over people's heads. I would say a few years ago, they went over my head, but like I think it's important to just kind of set the groundwork on that. So overall, you have to look at vehicles in terms of cost of goods sold. And cost of goods sold has two types of costs: variable costs and fixed costs. So fixed costs are things like your factory, it's like the rent, in things that stay steady on a program throughout its length. Then you have variable costs. These are the costs that go up with production. So if you look at, for example, GM, last year, they claimed that they had just reached the point where their cost of goods sold, which is what they're sell or where their vehicles were sold for the price of the variable cost. That doesn't mean they're gross profitable. That means it's that they covered the variable cost. In order to become gross profitable, you have to cover the variable cost and have enough volume in terms of variable cost profitable to then cover your fixed costs to become gross profitable. By all accounts, Ford did not cover variable costs. So the more vehicles they sold of the F-150 Lightning, the more money they lost, which is an unsustainable position. Now, if you're a startup, sometimes you're in a position where you have to do that just to get your foot in the door, just to establish your market. But that's not a sustainable position. By most accounts, GM, due to tariffs on aluminum and supplies, is probably not variable cost profitable either on their electric vehicles. So they aren't able to reach those economies of scale either. So once you reach gross profitability, then which Rivian just reached to their point, then you have net profitability that comes after that. And that includes all of your research and development costs, your marketing costs, your operating costs, your finance costs, and your taxes to become net profitable. So there's an argument to be made for companies like Rivian and Neo. Neo's also gross profitable by double-digit margin, but losing lots of money on net to keep investing in that R&D and that marketing to develop that market, to develop that on an ongoing basis until you get to that point. Once you reach net profitability, which Tesla has and BYD has and Geely has, and the majority of cars sold in China are net profitable, once you reach that level, then there's an argument to say not getting too profitable on that and keep putting money into that R&D and building up your brand so that you can maintain your business. You can have a sustainable, viable business indefinitely and not turn a whole lot of net profit, right? You can have a high price earnings. That's how a lot of tech companies operate. But Ford is in this situation where the more of these vehicles they sold, the more money they lost. And in terms of general production costs, you're looking at over the period that Ford was making the F-150, around $50,000 in losses per vehicle. That's before you get into the $20 billion write-off, which would push that over $100,000 per vehicle. And that doesn't include the Rivian costs, losses that they had, which, if people remember, Ford invested in Rivian to help develop a EV truck platform, which is what the F-150 became. Overall, you're looking well into six figures in losses per vehicle on this, which from Ford's perspective is not sustainable. They did not have a regulatory requirement anymore to force them to keep making EVs, and they just
Yeah.
basically shift into a model where they are hoping to eventually become profitable on their electrified vehicles, which includes hybrids and plug-in hybrids, by 2029. Whereas according to Farley, there was no path to profitability ever on the F-150 Lightning project. So it
I
is
I think the
a
regulation side
tough situation.
is very important, relevant for the broader topic and story, which is basically companies either had to sell enough EVs to meet these fuel economy standards, or pay fines or buy regulatory credits from companies producing more than they needed to, for example, Tesla or Rivian. And so there was, even if they were losing money on one EV sold, they were perhaps in net doing better than if they had to pay fines or regulatory credits. So
Yeah.
so it was helping them financially, even if because otherwise you'd be like, well, why would you do it, right? But that's sort of the reason why. So yeah, that's a perfect, excellent summary. Um, yeah, so I would just transition to Steve here, but I will say that I do think two parts of Ford's problem, it appears, is that one, they tried to sort of copy the Tesla model, and basically Tesla was hugely successful with the Model 3, the model which got it to profitability, the Model Y, which became the best-selling vehicle model of any kind in the world. And then they announced the Cybertruck, and huge fanfare, over 1 million reservations. This is going to destroy pickup trucks in the US. I wrote this kind of thing as well, so I'm not making fun of people. but the thing is, when it was announced with about double the range it ended up getting for about half the price. So $40,000 truck with hundreds of miles of range, it was going to be transformative. And then when it finally came to market years later, it wasn't close to what it was supposed to be. So companies like Ford and Chevrolet that were like, okay, we can do an electric pickup truck. We better do it so we don't lose a big portion of our market to Tesla. We better be first. We better do this well. So they developed really good fully electric trucks, but they still suffered the same problem the Cybertruck has suffered, that the range per dollar is not nearly adequate. So they're not moving enough of these, and they can't sell them at a high enough price to match the cost. So that was one problem. The Silverado, I mean the F-150 Lightning, and then the Mustang Mach-E, which has been relatively successful, quite popular EV. I think a very well done EV. It's still not nearly at the volumes of the Model Y or Model 3, and Ford's not able to sell it enough or at high enough price to make it, really make their EV program successful. So they ended up trying to follow Tesla's lead, doing sort of what Tesla was doing with a crossover electric vehicle and a pickup truck, but just it never panned out. It never worked out. There was, a brief period after COVID lockdowns, opened up, that prices for these things was through the roof, and they must have been looking at this and being like, great, this is going to work. And then the economy changed. So, Steve, you've talked a bit about these things as well. What's your take on the Ford EV program as it was? And then you can lead us into where it's going as well more.
How did they possibly get into this situation? Was there nobody who drove one of the prototypes and said, hey, Jim Farley, guess what? This beast only goes 100 miles. And if you have anything in the load bed or you're towing anything, maybe we should take a look at this. But I don't know. Somehow or other, they were going to build Blue Oval City, and they were going to build the battery factory, and they were going to do a second generation electric truck, and they were going to throw all this money at it. They had to know that it didn't work. I don't understand it. I did. I mean, I see Larry's like, yeah, how did we get here? I mean, these people are professional managers of major corporations. It's incredible to me that they thought this was going to work. Didn't anybody say, Jim, this is not working, Jim? As a matter of fact, I've seen comments on the internet today that said that Jim Farley is probably going to join Herbert Deese on the front porch of a retired auto executive home someplace.
Yeah. Well,
I have a list of I was trying to build up an acronym, but I have a list of things on there. But I think number one, to your points, it's arrogance. I think that people looked at this kind of goofy guy at Tesla and they're like, oh, he made a profit doing that. We can make a profit doing that. We're the experts, right? And they had so much confidence in themselves. They're like, we can do this. And then the market looked at Elon. They're like, well, here's this guy. He can do it. And then everyone else is making announcements to pump up their stock price. And they went up with EV announcements not too long ago. And
yeah,
then greed gets in.
I think the stock is a big deal because not only did Tesla become profitable, but the stock went through the roof, through the clouds, through the stratosphere. Tesla became more valuable than like the next 10 automakers combined. So they all started looking, hey, what EV announcements can we make to show that we're serious and that we're going to be part of this and our stock will go up? And it seemed very clear that was happening for a while. And a lot of EV announcements were following the stock trend. I think that's critical. I would point out, I liked Jim Farley a lot. I thought he took a practical approach to these things. He was like, look, I drove across the country with the F-150 Lightning and it stunk not having superchargers. And so let's join the supercharger network. look, Tesla developed, with a startup, a great EV. Why don't we just create this startup team, Model E team, uh, Team Edison, or and create our own awesome EV. So I think he took a good approach to it. I praised him a lot. I liked him a lot. But I would remind people he is the cousin of Chris Farley. He's a performer. He's he's no. I know he comes from the auto industry, but I mean, just imagine it's Chris
Yeah.
Farley running your auto company. It's like, hey, let's do this. It's like, but he's got a little bit of that flair, that personality, that fun side, and he connects with people. And I feel like that's a big part of what got him there as well. And
Zach, that
I
may
still
be.
appreciate those things. I just yeah, I want to get yeah. Well, the other thing with Tesla, so Tesla was just not a replicable story. Like Elon and Tesla built up so much enthusiasm online that you had lines around the corner at 6 a.m. to get the Model 3 reserved. And it's just an abnormal phenomenon that we haven't seen again. We're not going to see again. And whatever it was that he was able to do to stir up that much demand, he still has this rabid, crazy, enthusiastic fan base that's got the stock sky high. It's just something that legacy automakers couldn't replicate, and I'm sure they were dying trying to figure out, like, what can we do to get this kind of enthusiasm, and they just couldn't. So I'll come back to that, but Steve, you wanted to step in there.
And gosh, I have a fine Irish heritage, and I love Jim Farley. He's a rocking kind of upfront Irish kind of guy. He doesn't take any backseat to anybody. But he's not the whole company. There's a whole coterie of people that report to him. So yeah, he's the face, but he doesn't make the decisions. At least not unilaterally. And I just don't know how the word didn't filter up to him. Was they afraid to say, Jim, guess what? We're going over the edge of a cliff on this project, and you need to know it. I mean, did he just wake up this week and say, oh, golly, I had no idea?
Well,
Hard for me to believe.
I think that part of it is his reports, and these people who were afraid to stick their neck out, afraid to take risks. They're it's a very entrenched bureaucratic organization that just does not move fast enough in this space to become competitive. I mean, I look at, to Zach's point, he drove across country. We have to make this change on this. That's a reactive statement. He should have known about that beforehand from his reports.
Agreed.
You look at Jim Farley went to China, got a Xiaomi SU7, drove it around. It's like, this is awesome. Like, we are not competitive with this. He should have had people telling him that before he tried to shift his company to that level. They benchmark a BYD several years ago, and they're like, we're not cost competitive. Let's try and get up to that cost competitiveness eventually. And, they're trying to do that with this new project. The one thing that keeps coming to mind with all this is, he's a little bit late to the game on all of these things each time this happens. But it reminds me of the 1980s, where you had the legacy automakers in the US benchmarking against Japanese cars, and then they would make a car to compete with that car, and it would come out 5 years later, at which point all of those competitors are 5 years more advanced and then some, and their cars never became competitive on these small fuel efficient vehicles versus Japan. So that's already happened. And I feel like with Farley and Ford, you have this organizational inertia that the best case scenario is they catch up to where the global industry was 5 years ago in a few years. But by then, the industry is going to be, 2 generations ahead.
Well, a
Well,
funny
when
thing
you
on
say
this
the
too.
industry, Larry, the industry is China.
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
Volkswagen. It's not Mercedes. It's not BMW, although they are making significant contributions. The industry is China. And
Yeah.
um, I don't know what it is that, well, yeah, I have some ideas. but China is able to iterate a new model in under a year. The same process in the U.S. takes 3 to 5 years, and in Europe, even longer. So China is innovating almost on a monthly basis, and they're just beating the competition um, in every aspect. And there doesn't seem to be anybody who's figured out how to address that issue. And unless they do, all of these legacy automakers are going to risk becoming either irrelevant or extinct.
So to that point, I think there's a there's something important, especially with Volkswagen. You look at BMW and some of these European automakers that they have one advantage over the US automakers is that there isn't as strong of an us versus them. We have to beat them. I think at this stage, the idea that we're going to beat China, China's already won if it's us versus them. Volkswagen, however, is collaborating with China. And all the companies are collaborating globally, taking the best technology, taking the best resources, and putting it together are the ones that are going to end up ahead. We cannot win against China. We can win with China. The companies that are going to win in Europe are the ones that are going to win in collaboration with those other organizations. And I think that,
Larry, did you hear a
back to
knock?
that arrogant thing, our idea is we're going to beat them because we're number one, USA number one all the time. And we're just not on this technology transformation.
Larry, did you hear a knock on the door? I think someone's there to deport you. No? Didn't someone just knock on your door to pull you out of?
I need to get dual citizenship for my wife first.
uh, well, let's not talk about that publicly. I have to ask you more about that on part. But that's actually what. Yeah, we're in the process of. But we'll talk about more off. But let's. I wanted to what you said about being reactive and behind. I started thinking about what Ford was doing 10 years ago, and so before Jim Farley, I almost said Chris Farley, before Jim Farley, Mark Fields was CEO and president of Ford, and before the Mustang Mach-E, they did almost nothing for years. We used to absolutely roast Ford. We were super critical of Ford for a long time. They developed the Ford Fusion Energy, the Ford C-Max Energy, these plug-in hybrids with very little batteries with little driving electric range. I remember they had a video. They were like proud that they were like, we didn't know where to put the battery, and then someone just got a box and they were like, hey, why don't we put it here in the trunk? And and they stuck their small battery in the trunk, shrunk the trunk space of the C-Max Energy, and made a YouTube video. And it was clearly like low effort, low seriousness all across the board on EVs. They had the Ford Focus Electric early on with very limited range. And that's all fine. That was an era when it was hard to do, when Tesla didn't have the Model 3, but they just weren't serious about it. And they just weren't trying to be ahead of the curve. And they were like, as you said, arrogant. And this was the industry as a whole. And I mean, I faced this. I was on so many expert meetings and calls where I was the idiot weirdo on the call because I thought Tesla had a future. I thought Tesla wasn't going to die an early death, and that EVs were going to grow. And all these experts were so full of arrogance and certainty that Tesla couldn't survive, and no one was going to sell EVs because no one wanted them. And then you had, like I said, the reservation lines for the Model 3, the success of Tesla, and then the whole industry was like, okay, we have to do something now. And there's this late reaction. As you said, China, on the other hand, they were working on it, you know? And it wasn't as obvious or visible at the time, but they were working on it. And you had tech companies forming, tech leaders who were like, hey, let's do an EV company. Like Xpeng, Neo, Li Auto, but basically they were just reactive and slow. And it was funny to me because when Mark Fields once he had left, I remember seeing an interview with him on CNBC where he was all about the future was going to be electric. that Ford and all the others had to get more focused and catch up, but it's really hard because you have the legacy dealers, you have the legacy infrastructure, sunk costs, but he was like completely different from how he sounded as a CEO and president. So it just made you wonder, like, what kind of discussions are actually going on? How much are they just constrained by this inability to evolve quickly, to transition quickly, and this just inability to know what to do? So, like, how to develop a really compelling, competitive EV that everyone wants, and then how to get your dealers to sell EVs. Like, this is one of the big barriers they've faced is how do they get their dealers to try? Because it's not just their employees, it's their independent dealers. So I think all of these together, it was just a recipe for you're just not going to succeed. Because I think they tried pretty hard. I think they did a pretty good job with the Mustang Mach-E and the Lightning EV. They just never had a chance is sort of I think the message. And then unless they were forced to do it, once they were not only not forced to do it, but Trump said, don't do it, anything they're going to want, anything they're going to need from the US government, they better be on the same page as Trump as being anti-EV, right? So I think they all just, conveniently made this shift. I'm curious to see what GM's going to do, but yeah, let's, who wants to?
That is an excellent question. Zach, there's a historical component here too. Anybody who's been covering the auto industry for a long time, I was involved for a while with the Saturn organization while they were trying to do new and do different things and getting hammered by the home office. The common phrase in Detroit is not invented here. If we didn't think of it, it's no good, and we don't want to know about it. General Motors, if Ford does something good with they invent a new kind of transmission, General Motors says, not invented here, not interested. Chrysler, same thing. So I think there is a lot of internal inertia within these companies that, yeah, the boss wants us to do this, but I don't know. I really don't think this is going to work. And so there's a lot of foot dragging, unfortunately. And I also want to
Yeah.
point out that Jim Farley did an absolutely awful job of trying to shove EVs down the throats of the dealer network. That was 2 years ago this year. And he sent out a letter. He said, you got 60 days to install chargers and sign up. And you got to sign this agreement saying you're going to invest so much money in tooling and education and so forth. And the dealers were shocked. And they're like, well, wait a minute. Nobody told us that this was going to happen. And as a matter of fact, a bunch of dealers got together and sued Ford. And the Ford eventually withdrew it, but it was so poorly handled by Jim Farley. It was almost like a Monty Python skit. He had no idea what he was doing, and it was totally bungled.
Yeah. I mean, that gets to another one on my list of like, causal things is that ignorance. Like just being willfully unaware of the progress that's happening elsewhere. You still hear people saying, "Oh, well, Chinese cars are crap." If you've seen them, it's night and day. Like it's just so much more advanced. And like then the other thing that comes back is, oh, they have to be cheating. Not that they have any evidence that they're cheating, not that there's any evidence that they're getting more subsidies than our automakers were getting. It's that they have to be cheating. It's just the assumption like, oh, no, they're not profitable. All of their financial statements are lies. It's this kind of willful
Yeah.
ignorance and denial that goes along with that you know, fuels this kind of falling behind constantly. And you would think that Detroit would have learned from the Japanese coming to the market. But I mean, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Yeah, I know that phrase. I like that one. I thought you were going to say history repeating itself, and I was thinking of that phrase. But yeah, I don't know. I thought the whole thing about Jim going to China and discovering how much better the EVs were, I thought it was like a little bit of exaggeration and like storytelling, but it does seem like every time they've looked at what Tesla's done, and looked at what the Chinese automakers done, they're like, wow, they're doing it way better and way cheaper. Like, and they have the idea we need to do that too, but they've just not been able to execute it. I do think a lot comes down at the end of the day, though, to how much they can stir up demand in order to have enough, you know, sell enough, produce enough, get costs down, all of the things, that you need to do. And I think that's what I end up hitting a wall at often. It's like, well, what could they do? They tried, I think, they they turned a Mustang into a electric crossover, like they built on the biggest model they have, the F-150, and tried to make it the best version. But it just, I mean, they've sold tens or hundreds of thousands, but it's not enough. And I don't know. I am very curious again now if this universal EV platform they're working on, is it going to be competitive in the future? Are they really going to come to the party? Or is it going to be another case of they're a few years late and they haven't done it quite well enough to be competitive? And that's the big question. I mean, I don't know. When did they even make the decision to do this? It's like, how recent was this shift decided? How much have
About
they
a year
put in
ago.
already?
The California Skunk Works started up about a year ago. It's being led by Doug Field, a former Ford executive who went to Apple to assist Apple with their electric car program. And when that program got shut down, he went back to Ford and they said, Doug, go out to California, take whoever you want with you, and just go out there and make it happen. The latest report I saw in the New York Times is that they are investigating uh, the use of high pressure castings for the front and rear of what is supposed to be a mid-sized electric truck. And then they swoosh it together around the battery pack. And that sounds to me exactly like the Tesla unboxed factory approach.
Do you think there's any concern that the Apple EV project never got off the grounds, never got public, that Doug was part of?
Uh, well, um, there's a lot about that Apple project that we will never know publicly. They spent, by some estimate, I don't know how many billions of dollars on it, and it was over a period of 10 years, and nothing came of it. Maybe maybe that should have been assigned to some people. If Apple can't do this, maybe we should take a second look before we jump in with both feet.
I'm
So
still
there is
disappointed
something
in
with
Apple.
Apple. Apple was not, according to all accounts, Apple was never planning on building in the United States. They had been partnering with BYD and several other Chinese companies on development. And a lot of what I have heard is that when we started clamping down on China, that was their supply chain for their phones already. But in terms of automotive supply chain, that was also going to be a big part of it, with Apple doing the design and a lot of the customer interface. Um, when you cut that off, all of a sudden that product no longer becomes viable. In some ways, it was similar to what Xiaomi did with their car project, except that Xiaomi had the supply base in all of the different technology suppliers that would do what isn't their core competency and get them up to that automotive level. Apple has never been trying to do everything. They do what's best, they do best, and then they contract the engineering and manufacturing out to other people. So that business model, due to political changes, was untenable.
That's interesting. Interesting insights. It makes a lot of sense too, because we were not. I mean, Donald Trump made us very. I mean, we've had an anti-China thing going since at least the '90s, as far as I remember. But Donald Trump made that a big political issue, and then instead of differentiating himself from Trump, Biden just continued on with that, um, seemingly, calculating that people liked that. and that would be helpful for getting votes. And then they just stuck with it. So, yeah, I can definitely imagine that being the nail in the coffin for Apple. Well, let's just look
Zachary, let me
broadly.
ask you a question.
Go for it.
Have you seen any U.S. automakers, any dealers have ride and drive events? I know when I worked for Saturn, we used to rent space in malls, and we'd put the cars in vacant stores and sit there with some literature and talk to people. And they'd come in and they'd say, "Is that a Toyota?" We say, "No, it's not. That's a Saturn." They say, "Yeah, but Toyota makes it, don't they?" "Well, no, actually, it's made by General Motors." "Really? I didn't know that." And it was an educational outreach kind of thing. We were going to schools, we were going to employees or employers to show the car. I don't see the U.S. auto industry doing that. Um, it's got to be
That's a
6 or 7 years ago.
great point.
My wife and I were on Cape Cod, and we heard about an EV ride and drive event at the Falmouth Airport or someplace, and we went. And there were a couple of cars there. There was I mean, this is a long time ago. There were a couple of uh, uh, e-golfs, um, and I don't know what else. Maybe a Bolt or a Chevy Bolt or something. And people were riding around in them, and they were getting out and going, "Wow, I kind of like that." And
Yeah.
tell me more about this. How much does it cost? Where do I buy one? I don't understand why the U.S. automakers do not actively promote these products. They somehow expect people to just see it online and click a button and say, "Send one to my house." And
Yeah.
that's not marketing. I mean, these people know how to market, but they refuse to do it for electric cars. It mystifies me.
I think on a certain level, if they aren't meeting variable costs and the more you sell, the more you lose, they may not feel motivated
Well,
to sell
that's
more.
that's Sergio Macchione there from
Marchione,
Fiat
yeah.
years ago, begging people not to buy
But
the electric Fiat because they lost too much money on each
oh
car.
my god,
That's
Sergio.
not a sustainable business model, is it?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
first
mean,
of all, you have to do both, get the costs and get the marketing out. Like,
yeah,
I mean,
EV
it has to
advocates
be both.
for longer than I've been covering have been saying it's all about butts and seats. You got to get butts and seats. That annual National Drive Electric Week thing, I feel like it used to be a lot more popular. Now that EVs have become more popular, especially Teslas, I feel like those don't even have as much uh, uh, as much of a presence or impact as they did. But like you said, yeah, I mean, if you go to dealers to test drive an EV, I mean, I think you guys know the experience. You go and they have to find you the EV specialist, like like you're not a first class citizen, and you have to be shoveled off to the side while they wait for the EV guy to come around. And sometimes the EV guy is really enthusiastic about EVs, and times he's just like whatever, and he just knows enough about them to give you the test drive, but he doesn't really care. So yeah, and I mean, automakers rely on dealers for this kind of thing, but like you're saying, like maybe they could organize their own events in different big metro areas. Be like, hey, we're gonna host our own event here, our dealers will participate or whatever, but could be corporate driven. And yeah, I mean, I'm a big, I think you have to stir up the demand in order to get the variable costs, get profitable on variable with variable costs even. And I don't know. I would move on now just to what do we think is there's two questions I want to ask here, two topics. What do we think is going to happen with the rest of the US auto market following this? They often tend to I mean, with that case of superchargers, once Ford decided they were going to partner with Tesla and give their EV drivers access to superchargers, like every automaker had an announcement within a couple of weeks. Like everybody just jumped on board, even though this has been an option that was pushed for a decade. We wrote a big open letter to some companies about it. Um, so is there going to be a series of similar announcements? What are the other major automakers going to do? especially I'm curious about GM because like Cadillac has gotten to the point of 25% of their sales being electric vehicles. It seems to me like they really are on board and they want it. They're making this transition. They have several models. Their market share of EVs just kept rising and rising. But yeah, what do we see that? And then separately, the politics of it, the policy and politics of EVs. But yeah, start with the rest of the auto industry.
You
Well, I
want an
guess.
off the cuff opinion? I think I think the EV space in the United States is going to enter a period of what we used to call nuclear winter. And until such time as the policies and at the top of the federal government change, I think we might stay at roughly the market share that we've had, around 8, 9%. Maybe it might get to 10%, but um, I really don't see it having a breakout moment so long as this administration is putting so much weight into opposing anything to do with electric vehicles or renewable energy or anything else that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, nuclear winter's not a bad analogy. I mean, I think that we're going in a very tight space here. There's not the regulatory justification for selling EVs with the tax credits removed, which a lot of people are paying attention to the consumer one, but there was also a business one, and a lot of businesses buying these large SUVs are buying them under a tax break that they get for these, commercial vehicles. And when I say business, I'm saying your accountant, your, like the weed dispensary guy has a Cybertruck. Like these types of vehicles are considered businesses. Freelancers can write those off in terms of the tax write-off for large vehicles. And then you have the EV tax write-off. So that's going to be challenged right now. Um, I think that they have been, especially Detroit, has been very successful at blocking foreign competition. How sustainable that is without consumer backlash knows. I mean, they can sustain that for a while unless there's consumer backlash. Uh, if there is consumer backlash and people see, hey, I want something better, then we could see, market viable vehicles without subsidies hitting our markets. That's a distinct possibility. And yeah, it's going to be a tough situation. I do see GM continuing to scale back. They've already scaled back a number of their plans. I think that we're going to see kind of baseline production continuing, almost more of a stopgap in case we see a policy change happen. But I don't see them having a massive growth spurt. Tesla's also not talking about massive, capacity increases. They aren't building new factories. So I think that the US is going to be in a long kind of stagnant thing. And there's a lot of political forces, both on the left and the right, who want to maintain the status quo, both from legacy industry as well as legacy energy.
Yeah.
And I think that will have to change before the politics change, which then changes, the overall situation.
Yeah, Tesla's still trying to get back to 2023 levels. But the one interesting thing here, I'm assuming automakers across the board, legacy automakers, pull back. I'm a little curious about GM with the Cadillac brand, but these are BMW, Audi, Volkswagen. BMW and Audi have had high EV share of sales. Volkswagen has a very tiny portion of the US market, and it might see this still as a way that it could grow its market share by being different. But overall, Honda, Toyota, these companies that sort of were forced into it and came late to the party, I don't see them trying harder for sure. But one thing that made me think is, for a while, I started worrying about if Rivian had a future because it took them a long. I mean, they've got the expensive, low volume models, and they're, this 2026, they're supposed to start bringing out, more affordable mass market models. And my concern was like, well, there's a lot of competition on the market now. It's not 2016. It's hard to break in and scale up massively a new model when there's, a dozen or 2 dozen options in the same vein that you can get from other, automakers. But if they're all pulling back, it sort of opens a door for Rivian to actually have that Model 3 kind of moment that Tesla had, with Elon Musk pushing people away from Tesla as well, and Tesla sort of having quite old models that are sort of just all over the place in some cases, and sort of, become boring for some people. Maybe Rivian has the perfect opening it needs to get the R2 and R3 to profitability and get itself to profitability. So I'm very curious to see what happens with Rivian, but I'm still nervous. Like, I don't really know. It's not 2016. Like, and it's not like Elon, his ability and Tesla's ability to stir up enormous viral demand for its vehicles through the early days is something that it's just not really normal. So I don't know if Rivian will be able to do something similar, but that's the one positive potential for me, is maybe all of this stuff scaling back is going to open up the door for Rivian. With policy overall, I
So,
mean, yeah, go ahead.
oh, I was going to say with Rivian, they just hit gross profitability, which Ford and GM have not.
Mhm.
So they're still losing money on a net basis, but they hit that. So with more volume, they get closer to net profitability. And if they can just break even in terms of overall and then just keep investing in more R&D, they'll be in good shape. They also have Volkswagen at their back, which is a major investor, and
And Amazon.
Volkswagen potentially could provide more support. They could provide more technology support. They have access to technology resources that Volkswagen is also developing with other companies in Europe, namely China. So they're developing capabilities with China in Europe that could trickle into Rivian models because of that partnership as well. Just by being part of that ecosystem, I think that's a potential. I think Rivian is not, although clearly, especially with Biden, the escalation of protectionism was to protect legacy automakers and the union employees within that. I think that's going to have the side effect of helping Rivian as a startup by
Yeah.
protecting them from international competition.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so last thing, my first article on this Ford story ended up being a very late night rant on U.S. politics and policy, but I think this is what it comes down to, is that we have ceded long-term vision and technological leadership to others for decades now, and we are too complacent, too much wanting to stick to what we have and not grow, not evolve, and just don't have we have too much political division and too much tribal politics that we can no longer come together and say, look, this is going to be better for our country long term if we're a leader in this space. And I think there's a lot of politicians who understand this and they know this, but they're just slaves to the current political order and the current political system. And I mean, we elected, I ranted because, we elected George W. Bush. The guy had failed upward his whole life. It was mind blowing to me. He was legitimate failure, like, repeatedly, and ended up president of the United States with strong ties oil and gas industry. No surprise, politics shifted more and more to oil and gas side with Republicans. Donald Trump comes along. We don't even need to comment, but the complete aggression and animosity and fighting against technological evolution is crushing the U.S. We are getting crushed in our consumer choices, our economy, our our ability to be global leaders again. We've just ceded that role, and a lot of people don't accept it, don't believe it. They think we're still the leaders, number one in everything. You know, there's a lot of funny memes that go around Europe actually about how the US thinks it's number one in everything, and it's like number 56 and 37 and stuff in a lot of categories. But with this case particularly, everybody else in the world pretty much can see that it's a switch to zero emissions technologies. And if you want to lead in a global economy, you have to be strong supporting these. And we have not just been weak, we just waffle back and forth. We barely get anything done. And then once we have some progress and momentum, it gets crushed by a new oil soaked political administration. And it's shameful, it's disastrous, it's going to continue to hurt our country and hurt people here. But we're too ignorant and arrogant. It's coming back to your to recognize where we are and where we need to go in order to be leaders. And in terms of the auto industry, they're not going to save us. They're not going to. They might see what's happening, but they're quarter to quarter, and they're not looking 5 years down the road. They're looking next year at the most. And I just think it's an indictment on the disaster of a political situation this country has turned into, and how much. I mean, put the blame on Americans too. I know you're not supposed to do this, but people are too uninformed, they don't want to know how to govern their country. They don't want to know how the country is being governed, and they get too easily triggered by one rage bait topic or another. I mean, in the end, we don't really have thoughtful policy making. We don't have a push for it, a drive for it. Because the masses don't really care. They don't think about it. They're not interested in it, and they don't care enough to force policymakers to have a good long-term united vision. And I think that's just the reality of where we are. And with that being the case, we have the worst automotive policies on the planet, basically, especially, I mean, among major countries, economies at least. We have It's like we're like a kindergartner who hasn't learned to even read and write yet, compared to what other countries and economies are trying to do to be leaders of the next 50, 100 years. And like, that's just where we are. I mean, we just have to accept, maybe, I mean, maybe people say we shouldn't, but that's where we are. And how are you going to change that? Our political situation is such a disaster. There's never an effort to cross aisles now, to work together. I mean, Joe Biden was focused on that, but it was like, that was a disaster of an idea, because that's not where our politics is. If you work with the enemy, you know, you're horrible. And I don't know, until we get back to a country that wants to work together, until we get back to a United States that wants to work together, I just don't see how we lead on this again. So that's my very optimistic take at the end of our discussion. You guys give your
I
final
feel better.
Yeah. To that point, we, all of us are more on the left side of the spectrum, but we need both liberals and conservatives, people who want small government and maximum efficiency, and the people who want government to accomplish something, to both be working towards the same objective. And that's a problem. If we don't have those conservative voices be like, hey, maybe we should trim some cost here, maybe we should do some of this there, sometimes that's frustrating because it gets in the way of the progress that we want to. Sometimes it is. However, sometimes the costs are too high. Sometimes it is better for market-based solution than for government-based solution. I've been advocating for where the government plays a better role in terms of distribution of energy and, a lot of this infrastructure. But sometimes it's better to let the private sector do what's right. We need both of those, and they both need to be working towards the same goal. But on both sides right now, I feel like fear is the dominant force. Like, I wrote down all these things and then I underlined fear, because it's a fear of change and a fear of the other. And right now, the change is being driven by an other in terms of China, with which you just hit both of those kind of things going on. But regarding Ford especially, we can't expect the leaders of the last century to be the leaders of the next century automatically. We can't expect all of that to just be continuous. At a certain level, we have to accept and embrace creative destruction is going to happen. New countries are going to rise, new companies are going to rise, new technologies are going to rise, but we have to be able to embrace that. We have to embrace the other because this is a country made of others that came together. And our industry's successes have come from others coming together. You know, it wasn't just American scientists who put a man on the moon, although the people we worked with are a little controversial in terms of how we got there. You know, it was a number of people coming together from different backgrounds. Nikola Tesla was an immigrant. Like, no, start
Yeah.
bringing all this stuff together and then we can accomplish what we want. But there's this fear of change and this fear of the other that's really driving all of it.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. Steve, final words?
Well, I just you mentioned something near and dear to my heart. Tom Lehrer did a wonderful satire about Werner von Braun, and if you haven't heard it, find it on the internet. It's absolutely brilliant. The final line goes like this: "Once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department," says Werner von Braun.
Yep.
And if
Yeah.
Tom Lehrer was just a brilliant satirist, I
Yeah.
miss him.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway.
My grandfather actually guarded Werner von Braun when he was in White Sands, New Mexico, developing the space program for the
Yeah.
United States. So,
He did what?
evidently, he had very bad jokes.
What did your grandfather do?
When he was in White Sands, New Mexico, they were developing, you know, rockets for the space program, and he was one of the people who were guarding the German scientists that were
Okay.
helping to
Wow.
develop our space program.
Wow.
He came to World War II at the very end, so he ended up, you know, mostly being stateside.
Zachary, you raise an excellent point. We lurch from one political directive to the 180 degrees opposite. China has some issues. They may have some people that live there that are not treated fairly. They may have human rights violations. Their government may be more, well, it's hard to say if they're more authoritarian than the American government today. But they have policies. They have 5-year plans. And they, you know, as Forrest Gump said, if you don't know where you're going, you're not likely to wind up there. And we don't know where we're going. The Chinese have a very clear idea of where they want to be 5 years from now, and they have a habit of getting there and getting there early. We have no idea where we want to be 5 years from now, and our policies just go off in diametrically opposed directions every time there's an election cycle. And quite frankly, that is probably our biggest flaw as a society if we want to compete on a global scale. How can you compete when business has no way of predicting what the policies are going to be next week or next year?
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I think we're all on the same page. Let's just end. Steve, could you end with one of the sayings of your old Irish grandmother?
Oh my gosh, which one?
I don't know.
So your favorite was "There's many a slip twixt the cup and the lip," and you know, for Ford, they had this vision, and they were just going to throw money at it and assign some engineers to it, and it was all going to be great, and it just turned out horribly. They should have known better. It was very poorly managed, and it starts at the top, but it goes all the way down to the engineering and development teams. People should have. I mean, these companies live and die by their accountants. The accountants tell them, "Yeah, this is good," or "That's not good," and somebody must have been whispering in their ear and saying, "We got a real problem with these electric trucks. You know, we need to figure this out." How it got to this point, no idea.
Well, there it is. Tune in next time for another uplifting, exciting chat on how the U.S. will lead again. No. Maybe we'll get to that topic. All
Well,
right. Thank you all.
I have a solution. Vote for Mark Kelly.
I was like, is this a whole nother hour? Yeah, we will continue the discussion. Thank you guys. Yeah, Steve is early on the Mark Kelly train. We're gonna I'm sure we'll come back to that. Thank you all both.
All right.
Cheers.
Adios.